Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one nobody is watching. She walked in wearing old jeans and a loose flannel shirt. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She had no patches on her sleeve, no military tattoos on her arms, no swagger in her step. She looked like someone who had taken a wrong turn on the highway and ended up at the wrong place. The men standing around the shooting range that morning barely looked at her. Some of them smiled. A few of them whispered jokes to each other. One of them laughed and said something about a lost tourist. Nobody knew her name. Nobody cared. And that was their first mistake. Because within the next 40 minutes, this quiet woman from a small town in Montana was going to pick up a rifle that most trained soldiers struggle to master, and she was going to put every single round exactly where it needed to go. She was going to silence an entire range full of Navy SEALs, and not a single one of them would ever forget it. Her name was Elena Marsh. She was 34 years old. She had been born and raised on a cattle ranch about 60 miles outside of Great Falls, Montana. The ranch sat at the edge of a long valley, surrounded on 3 sides by mountains, and on the 4th side by a dirt road that led to a small highway. It was the kind of place where the nearest neighbor lived 8 miles away, and the nearest grocery store was a 40-minute drive. Elena had grown up in that silence. She had grown up in that emptiness. And most importantly, she had grown up with a rifle in her hands since she was 6 years old. Her father, Dale Marsh, had been a rancher his whole life. His father before him had been a rancher too, and his father before that. The Marsh family had worked that same piece of land for 4 generations. Dale was a hard man, not cruel, but hard. He believed in work. He believed in discipline. He believed that the land did not care about your feelings or your excuses. If a storm was coming, you prepared. If a fence was broken, you fixed it. If a predator was hunting your cattle, you dealt with it. And dealing with it, in Dale's world, meant one thing. You picked up your rifle, you walked out into the dark, and you handled the problem yourself. Elena learned to shoot before she learned to ride a bicycle. Her father had placed a small .22 caliber rifle in her hands when she was barely tall enough to hold it steady. He had shown her how to load it, how to hold it against her shoulder, how to breathe before pulling the trigger. He had set up tin cans on a fence post about 30 yards away and told her to hit them. She missed the first 5 shots. She missed the next 5 too. Her arms were tired. Her shoulder was sore from the recoil. She wanted to stop. She wanted to go inside and eat lunch. But Dale did not move. He stood behind her with his arms crossed and said nothing. He just waited. So Elena loaded the rifle again. She lined up the sight. She took a slow breath, and she squeezed the trigger. The tin can flew off the fence post and tumbled into the dirt. Dale nodded once. He did not smile. He did not clap. He just said, "Again." And Elena did it again, and again, and again. By the time she was 10 years old, she could hit a target at 200 yards without thinking about it. By the time she was 14, her father had moved her up to a .30 caliber bolt-action rifle. By the time she was 18, there was not a single person in their county who could outshoot her. But Elena never saw herself as special. Shooting was not a talent to her. It was not a hobby. It was just something she did, the same way she fed the horses or repaired the fences or drove the truck into town for supplies. It was part of her life. It was part of who she was. She never competed in any shooting tournaments. She never joined any clubs. She never posted videos online or bragged to anyone about what she could do. She just lived her life on the ranch, quiet and steady, doing what needed to be done. When Elena was 22, her father died. A heart attack took him in the middle of the night, out on the porch, sitting in the same chair he had sat in every evening for 30 years. Elena found him the next morning. His coffee cup was still on the railing. His boots were still on his feet. He looked peaceful, like he had simply decided to close his eyes and not open them again. Elena buried him on the ranch, on a hill that overlooked the valley. She stood there alone at the grave and did not cry, not because she did not feel the pain. She felt it deeper than anything she had ever felt in her life. But Dale had taught her something that went beyond shooting. He had taught her how to stand still when everything inside her was falling apart. After her father's death, Elena ran the ranch alone. It was hard. It was exhausting. Some mornings she woke up before the sun and did not stop working until long after it had set. She lost weight. She lost sleep. She lost track of the days, but she kept going. She kept the cattle fed. She kept the fences strong. She kept the land alive. And every evening, when the work was done, she would walk out to the back field with her rifle and shoot. She would set up targets at different distances. She would practice different positions. She would lie flat on her stomach in the grass and shoot at targets 300 yards away, then 400, then 500. She did not know why she kept doing it. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was comfort. Maybe it was the only thing that still connected her to her father. Whatever the reason, she kept shooting. And she kept getting better. Years passed. Elena turned 28, then 30, then 32. The ranch was doing well enough. She had hired a couple of part-time hands to help with the cattle during busy seasons. She had a small circle of friends in town. She went to the diner on Sunday mornings for breakfast. She went to the hardware store on Wednesdays. She lived a simple life, and she was mostly content with it. Then one day, everything changed. It started with a phone call. Elena's cousin Marcus called her on a Tuesday afternoon. Marcus was 10 years older than Elena. He had left Montana when he was 18 and joined the Navy. He had gone through basic training, then advanced training, then selection. He had become a Navy SEAL. He had served for 16 years and had deployed to places he was not allowed to talk about. He had seen things he would never share. He had done things that kept him awake some nights. But he had survived it all, and he had retired with honor. Now he lived in Virginia Beach, near the base where he had spent most of his career. He worked as a civilian contractor, helping to train the next generation of SEALs. Marcus and Elena had always been close. When they were kids, he used to visit the ranch every summer. They would ride horses together. They would fish in the creek. And they would shoot. Even back then, Marcus had noticed something about his younger cousin. She was steady. She was patient. She had a natural calm that most people never develop, no matter how much they train. He had watched her shoot and had thought, even as a teenager, that she had something rare. Now on the phone, Marcus told Elena something that made her pause. He said there was going to be a special event at the training facility near Virginia Beach. It was an annual thing. A kind of open demonstration day where active duty SEALs and some retired operators would show their skills on the range. There would be long-range shooting, close-quarters drills, and timed exercises. It was mostly an internal event, meant to build morale and keep the competitive spirit alive among the teams. But every year, a few civilians were invited to watch, and sometimes, if the mood was right and the officers allowed it, a civilian guest could step up and take a shot. Marcus wanted Elena to come. He said he had told a few of his buddies about her, about how she had been shooting since she was a child, about how accurate she was. They had laughed. Not in a mean way, he said, but in the way that men who have trained for years in the most elite military unit in the world laugh when someone tells them about a ranch girl from Montana who can shoot. They were polite about it. They said that was nice. They said she was probably pretty good for a civilian, but their smiles said something else. Their smiles said that there was a difference between shooting tin cans off a fence and shooting under pressure with real operators watching. Elena listened to all of this. She did not say anything for a long moment. She was sitting on the porch of her ranch house, looking out at the same valley her father had looked at every evening. The sun was going down. The sky was turning orange and pink. The horses were standing near the fence, waiting for their evening feed. Eleanor took a slow breath. She said, okay, she would come. 2 weeks later, Elena packed a small bag, left the ranch in the care of her hired hands, and drove to the airport in Great Falls. She had not flown on an airplane in over 5 years. She did not like airports. She did not like crowds. She did not like the way people in cities moved so fast and talked so loud. But she had told Marcus she would come, and she was not the kind of person who broke a promise. The flight took her to Norfolk, Virginia. Marcus picked her up at the airport in his truck. He looked older than she remembered. His hair was shorter. His face was thinner, but his eyes were the same, sharp, warm, steady. He hugged her and threw her bag in the back and started driving. On the way, he told her about the event. He told her about the men who would be there. He told her about the rifles they would be using. He told her about the targets and the distances and the scoring system. Elena listened carefully. She asked a few questions. Mostly, she just watched the road and took it all in. They arrived at Marcus's house late that night. It was a small place near the beach. Simple. Military neat. Marcus showed her to the guest room and told her to get some sleep. The event was the next day, and it started early. Eleanor unpacked her bag, brushed her teeth, and lay down on the bed. She stared at the ceiling for a long time. She was not nervous. She was not excited. She was just thinking about what it would feel like to be surrounded by men who had fought in wars, who had trained every single day of their adult lives, who were considered the best of the best. She thought about her father. She thought about the tin cans on the fence post. She thought about the sound the rifle made when the bullet left the barrel and the silence that followed before the target fell. Then she closed her eyes and fell asleep. The next morning, Marcus drove them to the facility. It was a large property, spread out over several acres, surrounded by fences and security checkpoints. There were multiple shooting ranges, both indoor and outdoor. There were obstacle courses. There were buildings used for close-quarters combat training. There were vehicles and equipment scattered across the grounds. A whole place had a feeling of purpose. Everything was there for a reason. Nothing was wasted. When Elena stepped out of the truck, she noticed the men immediately. They were everywhere, standing in groups, tucked in Dickenstack in Pebber, stretching, checking gear, talking in low voices. They were all in good shape, lean and strong, with the kind of muscle that came from years of real physical work, not from a gym. They moved differently than regular people. There was a confidence in their movements, a kind of quiet awareness, like they were always paying attention to everything around them, even when they seemed relaxed. Elena recognized that quality. Her father had moved the same way, not the military part, but the awareness, the calmness, the sense of being ready for whatever came next. Marcus introduced her to a few people, his friends, his former teammates. They were polite. They shook her hand. They smiled. A few of them looked at her a little too long, like they were trying to figure out what she was doing there. One of them, a tall man with a thick beard and sunglasses pushed up on his forehead, asked Marcus quietly if this was the cousin he had been talking about. Marcus nodded. The tall man looked at Elena again and smiled in a way that was friendly, but also slightly amused. Elena noticed but said nothing. She just smiled back. The morning events began. Elena stood to the side and watched. The first exercise was a timed close-quarters drill. Teams of 4 moved through a mock building, clearing rooms and engaging targets. They were fast. They were precise. They communicated without speaking, using hand signals and body movements that Elena could not follow. It was impressive. She had never seen anything like it. These were not men who had learned to shoot. These were men who had been forged into weapons through years of relentless training and real-world combat. She respected it deeply. The next exercise was a medium-range accuracy drill. Individual shooters stepped up to a line and engaged steel targets at distances from 100 to 300 yards. They used standard issue rifles. The targets were small. The time limits were tight. Most of the shooters hit their targets consistently. A few missed 1 or 2. The crowd around the range watched quietly, offering the occasional nod or comment. Elena watched too. She studied their posture. She studied their breathing. She noticed small details. The way one shooter adjusted his grip slightly between shots. The way another tilted his head just a fraction before squeezing the trigger. She filed all of it away in her mind without even realizing she was doing it. Then came the long-range section. This was the part Marcus had told her about. A special rifle was brought out. It was a precision bolt-action sniper rifle, the kind used by SEAL snipers for long-range engagements. It was heavy. It was powerful. It was equipped with a high magnification scope that could pick up details at distances most people could not even see with their bare eyes. The targets were set up at 500, 700, and 1,000 yards. The wind was blowing from the east at about 8 miles per hour. The sun was high. The conditions were challenging. One by one, the shooters stepped up. These were not regular SEALs. These were the snipers, the specialists, the men who had spent years mastering the art of putting a bullet exactly where it needed to go from distances that seemed impossible. They were calm. They were focused. They took their time. They read the wind. They adjusted their scopes. And they fired. Most of them hit the 500-yard target with ease. The 700-yard target was harder, and a few rounds drifted slightly off-center. The 1,000-yard target was the real test. At that distance, everything mattered. The wind, the temperature, the humidity, the angle, the heartbeat of the shooter. A few of the snipers hit it clean. A few came close, but not quite. The crowd murmured with appreciation after each shot. Elena watched all of it. She did not move. She did not speak. She just stood there with her arms at her sides, watching every single shot, watching every single adjustment, watching every single result. And somewhere inside her, something quiet and familiar began to stir. It was not ego. It was not competition. It was something deeper than that. It was the same thing she felt every evening on the ranch when she walked out to the backfield with her rifle. It was the feeling of knowing that she could do this, knowing that the distance did not scare her, knowing that the wind was just another variable, like the weather on the ranch, something to be read and respected and accounted for. She took a slow breath and let it out. She did not say a word to anyone, but inside her mind, a single thought formed, clear and steady like a bullet finding its path through the air. She wanted to shoot, and she was about to get her chance. The long-range portion of the demonstration was winding down. The last few snipers were finishing their rounds, collecting their gear, and stepping back from the firing line. The crowd of operators, trainers, and invited guests had thinned slightly as some drifted toward the refreshment area set up near the main building. The mood was loose and relaxed. People were laughing, shaking hands, slapping each other on the back. It had been a good day so far. The performances had been solid. Everyone was in good spirits. Marcus stood next to Elena near the edge of the long-range shooting lane. He had been quiet for a while, watching her face as she watched the shooters. He knew that look. He had seen it on the faces of operators right before a mission. That still, focused calm that came from somewhere deep inside. He had seen Elena wear that same expression as a child on the ranch, standing behind a fence post with a rifle pressed to her shoulder, her eyes locked on a target 100 yards away. She had not changed. She had just grown into it. Marcus leaned over and spoke quietly to her. He asked if she wanted to try. Elena looked at him. She did not answer right away. She looked back at the range. The 1,000-yard target was still standing at the far end, a steel plate the size of a dinner plate, barely visible to the naked eye. The wind had picked up slightly. The flags along the range were fluttering at a sharper angle than before. She studied them for a moment. Then she looked at Marcus and nodded. Just once. No smile, no excitement, just a nod. Marcus walked over to one of the range officers. His name was Lieutenant Commander Holt. He was a tall, lean man in his mid-40s, with a shaved head and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. Holt had served 20 years in the teams. He had been a sniper himself, one of the best in his generation. Now he oversaw training and ran events like this one. He was respected by everyone on the base, and his word on the range was final. Marcus spoke to Holt in a low voice. He explained who Elena was. He told him about her background, about the ranch, about the years of shooting. He asked if she could take a shot during the open portion of the event. Holt listened with his arms crossed. He looked past Marcus at Elena, who was still standing near the shooting lane, looking out at the targets. He studied her for a few seconds. Then he looked back at Marcus. Holt did not say no, but he did not say yes right away either. He asked a few questions. Had she ever fired a bolt-action precision rifle before? Marcus said yes. She had been shooting bolt-action rifles since she was a teenager. Had she ever shot at distances beyond 500 yards? Marcus said she regularly shot at targets between 500 and 800 yards on the ranch. Had she ever shot under observation or any kind of pressure? Marcus paused on that one. He said no. She had never shot in front of anyone except her father and himself. It had always been just her and the land and the target. Holt thought about it for a moment. Then he uncrossed his arms and said fine. He said she could take a spot during the open portion if she wanted, but she would follow the same rules as everyone else. Same rifle, same targets, same conditions, no special treatment. Marcus thanked him and walked back to Elena. He told her what Holt had said. Elena listened and nodded again. She did not ask any questions about the rules or the rifle or the targets. She just asked one thing. She asked Marcus to show her which rifle she would be using. Marcus led her over to the equipment table near the firing line. The rifle was still there, resting on a padded mat. It was a Mk13 Mod 7, a precision sniper rifle chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum. It was heavy. It was long. It was fitted with a Schmidt and Bender scope that cost more than most people's cars. Elena looked at it the way a mechanic looks at an engine, not with awe, not with intimidation, with understanding. She studied the stock, the barrel, the bolt, the scope. She did not touch it. She just looked. Then she asked Marcus about the ammunition. He told her the round, the grain weight, the muzzle velocity. She did mental math in her head, calculating drop and drift based on the wind she had observed. Marcus watched her do this and felt a strange mix of pride and nervousness. He had told his friends she was good. He believed she was good, but this was different. This was not the ranch. This was a Navy SEAL training facility, and the men watching were among the most skilled marksmen on the planet. The open portion of the long-range event was announced about 20 minutes later. Holt stood at the front of the range and explained the format. It was informal. Anyone who wanted to shoot could step up. Active duty, retired, civilian guests. The targets would remain at 500, 700, and 1,000 yards. Each shooter would get 5 rounds. They could engage any target in any order. Scores would be based on accuracy and consistency. There were no prizes. It was just for the experience. A few active duty SEALs went first. They performed well. Solid groupings at 500. Good hits at 700. Mixed results at 1,000. The crowd clapped and nodded after each shooter. Then a retired operator stepped up. He was older, maybe 50, with grey in his beard and a slight limp in his left leg. But when he lay behind the rifle and settled in, his body went completely still. He fired 5 rounds in less than 2 minutes. All 5 hit center mass at 700 yards. The crowd gave him a louder round of applause. He stood up, smiled, and walked back to his friends. Then Holt looked toward Marcus and gave a small nod. It was Elena's turn. She walked forward. The range went quiet. Not silent, but the volume dropped noticeably. People who had been talking stopped mid-sentence. People who had been looking at their phones put them away. Everyone's attention shifted to the woman in the flannel shirt who was now stepping up to the firing line. Some of the men recognized her as the civilian guest Marcus had brought. A few exchanged glances. One of them leaned over to his buddy and whispered something. His buddy smirked. Elena did not notice any of this, or if she did not care. She walked to the mat where the rifle was resting. She knelt down beside it. She placed her hands on the stock and the barrel and lifted it slowly, feeling its weight, its balance. She had never held this exact rifle before, but she had held rifles like it. Bolt action, heavy barrel, precision scope. The fundamentals were the same. She knew how to read a scope. She knew how to work a bolt. She knew how to manage recoil. The rest was just math and patience and breathing. She lay down on the mat in a prone position. She placed the rifle against her shoulder and settled the stock into the pocket between her shoulder and her collarbone. She adjusted her body slightly, aligning her spine with the barrel. She placed her left hand under the stock for support and wrapped her right hand around the grip. Her finger rested alongside the trigger guard, not on the trigger. Not yet. The 500-yard target came into focus. It was clear, sharp. She could see the marks from previous hits on the steel plate. She adjusted the scope slightly, dialing in the elevation and windage based on the calculation she had done in her head. She took a breath, let half of it out. The crosshairs settled on the center of the target. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked. The recoil pushed back into her shoulder. She did not flinch. She did not move. She kept her eye on the scope and watched. A fraction of a second later, there was a sharp metallic ring from 500 yards down range. Dead center, the crowd murmured. A few people nodded. Elena worked the bolt. The spent casing ejected with a soft click. She chambered the next round. She shifted her aim to the 700-yard target. It was smaller in the scope now, harder to see clearly. The wind had shifted slightly, coming more from the southeast. She adjusted the scope again. 2 clicks to the right, 1 click up. She settled her breathing. She waited for the wind to steady. When it did, she squeezed the trigger again. Another crack, another ring. Dead center at 700 yards. The murmuring got louder. A few of the men stepped closer to the lane. The tall man with the beard who had smiled at her earlier was no longer smiling. He was watching with his arms crossed and his eyes narrowed. One of the range instructors pulled out a spotting scope and zeroed in on the 700-yard target. He looked at it for a moment, then looked back at Elena, then looked at Holt. Holt's expression had not changed. He was watching her with the same calm attention he gave to every shooter. But there was something else in his eyes now. Something that had not been there before. Elena worked the bolt again. She had 3 rounds left. She shifted her aim to the 1,000-yard target. This was the one that mattered. This was the distance where everything had to be perfect. At 1,000 yards, A bullet travels for more than a full second before it reaches the target. In that time, the wind can push it several inches in any direction. The drop due to gravity is significant. Temperature and humidity affect the air density, which affects the bullet's trajectory. Even the rotation of the Earth plays a tiny role at this distance, though most shooters do not think about it consciously.
Everything has to come together. The math.
The wind reading, the trigger pull, the breathing, the heartbeat. Elena lay still. She studied the wind flags along the range. There were 3 of them, between her position and the 1,000-yard mark. The closest one showed a moderate crosswind from the right. The middle one showed a slightly different angle. The farthest one was hard to read, but she could see the fabric moving in a pattern that suggested the wind was swirling slightly at that distance. She made her adjustments. She dialed the scope. She waited. The range had gone completely quiet now. Nobody was talking. Nobody was moving. Every single person in the area was watching her. The active duty SEALs, the retired operators, the instructors, the officers, even the support staff who had been setting up equipment nearby had stopped what they were doing and turned to watch. There was a tension in the air that had not been there before. It was not hostile. It was not skeptical anymore. It was the kind of tension that comes when people realize they might be witnessing something they did not expect. Elena took a breath, a slow, deep breath that filled her lungs completely. She let half of it out. Her body relaxed. Her heartbeat slowed. The crosshairs settled on the center of the 1,000-yard target. She waited for the space between heartbeats, that tiny fraction of a second when the body is most still. And in that moment, she squeezed the trigger. The rifle fired. The sound rolled across the range like thunder. Elena kept her eye on the scope. She watched the trace of the bullet, the faint shimmer in the air as it traveled downrange. 1 second passed, then another half second. Then there was a sound, a sharp, clean, metallic ring that echoed back across the range from 1,000 yards away. Dead center. Nobody moved. For about 3 full seconds, nobody said a word. Then the tall man with the beard let out a breath and said a single word under his breath that Elena could not hear from where she was lying. One of the instructors lowered his spotting scope slowly and looked at the man next to him. Holt unfolded his arms. Elena had 2 rounds left. She did not sit up. She did not celebrate. She did not even look away from the scope. She worked the bolt, chambered another round, and aimed at the 1,000-yard target again. She made a tiny adjustment for a slight shift in the wind. She settled. She breathed. She fired. Another ring. Another hit. Center mass. 1 round left. She worked the bolt 1 final time. She lay there for a moment, perfectly still. The range was so quiet that someone standing 50 feet away later said they could hear the wind passing over the grass. Elena made 1 more adjustment to the scope. She exhaled slowly. She squeezed the trigger. The last round flew downrange and struck the 1,000-yard target with a sound that rang across the entire facility. 3 shots at 1,000 yards. 3 hits. All of them center mass. Elena lifted her head from the scope. She pulled the bolt back, checked the chamber to confirm it was empty, and set the rifle down gently on the mat. She pushed herself up to her knees, then stood. She brushed the dirt off her flannel shirt and her jeans. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Then she turned around and faced the crowd. Nobody clapped right away. It was not that they did not want to. It was that they were still processing what they had just seen. A civilian woman, someone none of them had ever heard of, someone who had walked onto this range looking like she had come from a grocery store, had just put 5 out of 5 rounds on target, including 3 consecutive hits at 1,000 yards in shifting wind conditions, using a rifle she had never fired before in her life. That was not luck. Luck does not hit 3 times in a row at 1,000 yards. That was skill. Deep, refined, practiced skill that had been built over decades. The tall man with the beard was the first to move. He walked forward, stopped in front of Elena, and extended his hand. She took it. He did not say much. He just shook her hand firmly and said, "That was the best shooting I've seen from anyone who was not on a team." Coming from a man who had spent 15 years as a Navy SEAL, those words carried more weight than any trophy or certificate ever could. Then the others came. One by one, they walked up to her. They shook her hand. They introduced themselves. They asked her questions. Where did she learn to shoot like that? How long had she been doing it? What kind of training had she done? Elena answered all of them simply, And honestly, she told them about the ranch. She told them about her father. She told them about the tin cans on the fence post and the years of shooting in the backfield alone. She did not exaggerate. She did not boast. She just told the truth. Holt came over last. He stood in front of her and looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something that made Marcus, who was standing a few feet away, feel a swell of emotion he did not expect. Holt said, "Your father taught you well." Elena looked at him. For the first time that day, something shifted behind her eyes. Not tears, not quite, but something close. She nodded and said, "Yes, he did." The rest of that afternoon passed in a blur of conversations and handshakes and questions. Elena was pulled into groups of men who wanted to know more about her. Some of them wanted to know her technique. How did she read the wind? How did she control her breathing? How did she manage the recoil on a rifle that heavy? Others wanted to know about the ranch, about Montana, about what it was like to grow up in a place where the nearest neighbor was 8 miles away. Elena talked to all of them. She was quiet by nature, but she was not shy. She answered every question with the same calm, straightforward honesty that defined everything about her. Marcus stood back and watched. He felt a pride that went beyond what he had expected. He had always known his cousin was a remarkable shooter, but seeing her here, in this environment, surrounded by some of the most elite warriors in the world, holding her own, not just in skill but in character, it confirmed something he had always believed. That greatness was not about medals or uniforms or titles. It was about what you did when nobody was watching. It was about the years of quiet work, the thousands of hours of practice, the discipline that came not from a drill instructor, but from a father standing behind his daughter on a ranch in Montana, saying nothing but, again. As the day wound down and people started heading to their vehicles, Holt approached Marcus one more time. He pulled him aside and spoke in a low voice. He said he wanted to talk to Elena about something. Not today, but soon. He said there was a program, a specialized civilian training initiative that the military was developing. It involved bringing in exceptional civilian shooters to work with military snipers in controlled training environments. The idea was to expose military marksmen to different approaches and techniques, to break them out of the institutional patterns they sometimes fell into. Holt said that Elena's shooting style, her instinctive wind reading, her breathing technique, the way she managed the rifle without any formal military training, was exactly the kind of thing this program was looking for. Marcus listened. He was surprised but not shocked. He had seen the way Holt had watched Elena all day. He had seen the respect grow in the man's eyes with every shot she fired. He told Holt he would pass the message along. That evening, Marcus and Elena drove back to his house. They stopped at a small restaurant near the beach and ordered dinner. They sat across from each other at a table by the window. The ocean was dark outside, and the sound of the waves was low and steady. For a while, they did not talk about what had happened on the range. They talked about the ranch. They talked about family. They talked about their childhood summers together. It was comfortable. It was familiar. Then Marcus told her about Holt's offer. He explained the program. He explained what Holt wanted. He watched Elena's face as she listened. She did not react right away. She ate a piece of bread. She took a sip of water. She looked out the window at the dark ocean. Then she asked a question that Marcus did not expect. She asked whether her father would have wanted her to do it. Marcus thought about it for a long time before answering. He thought about Uncle Dale standing on the porch of the ranch house with his arms crossed, watching the valley. He thought about the way Dale had raised Elena, with patience and discipline and a quiet, unshakable love that he showed not through words but through time. He thought about what Dale would say if he could see what his daughter had done that day, if he could see the way she had walked onto a Navy SEAL training facility and earned the respect of every man there without raising her voice or trying to prove anything to anyone. Marcus looked at Elena and said, "I think he would have said, again." Elena stared at him for a moment. Then, for the first time that day, she smiled. But neither of them knew that the events of this day were just the beginning. What was about to unfold over the next few months would push Elena far beyond anything she had ever experienced on the ranch. It would test not just her skill with a rifle, but her strength, her courage, and her ability to survive in a world she had never imagined entering. And it would lead her to a moment that would change her life forever. 3 weeks after the demonstration day, Elena received a phone call from a number she did not recognize. She was standing in the barn on the ranch, cleaning the hooves of one of her older horses, a chestnut mare named Pepper, who had been with the family since Elena was in high school. The phone buzzed in her back pocket. She wiped her hands on her jeans and answered it. The voice on the other end was professional and direct. The man introduced himself as David Chen. He said he worked for a defense consulting firm that partnered with the United States military on specialized training programs. He said Lieutenant Commander Holt had recommended Elena for a position in a new program called the Civilian Marksmanship Integration Initiative. The program was designed to bring civilian shooters with exceptional skill into controlled military training environments to serve as guest instructors, demonstrators, and consultants. The goal was to introduce fresh perspectives into military sniper training by exposing active duty marksmen to civilian techniques that had been developed outside the traditional military framework. Chen explained the details carefully. The program would require Elena to travel to a secure training facility in the mountains of North Carolina for an initial evaluation period of 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, she would be observed and tested by military evaluators. If she passed the evaluation, she would be offered a position as a civilian consultant, working with small groups of military snipers on a rotating basis over the course of a year. The pay was significant. The commitment was flexible enough to allow her to return to her ranch between sessions. All travel and living expenses would be covered. Elena listened to all of this without interrupting. When Chen finished, she asked him one question. She asked whether she would be able to bring her own rifle. Chen paused. He had not expected that question. He said he would have to check, but he believed the evaluation would require her to use standardized military equipment. Elena said she understood. She asked for a few days to think about it. Chen gave her his number and told her to call whenever she was ready. After she hung up, Elena stood in the barn for a long time. Pepper nudged her shoulder with her nose, looking for the apple Elena usually brought. Elena reached into her jacket pocket and gave it to her. She watched the horse eat and thought about what she had just heard. A year ago, she had been a rancher who happened to be a good shot. Now the United States military was asking her to come teach their snipers. It felt unreal. It felt like something that happened to other people, to people in movies, not to a woman who spent most of her days feeding cattle and fixing fences. She called Marcus that evening. She told him about Chen's offer. Marcus was not surprised. He said Holt had already told him it was coming. He said Holt had been talking about Elena to people higher up the chain since the demonstration day. He said her performance had been recorded by a rangerside camera, and the video had been circulated among several senior training officers. Marcus said the general consensus was that Elena's shooting was among the most technically clean they had ever observed from a non-military marksman. Some of them had been skeptical until they saw the footage. After watching it, nobody questioned it. Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that caught Marcus off guard. She said she was scared. Not of the shooting, not of the evaluation. She said she was scared of leaving the ranch. She had not been away from it for more than a few days at a time since her father died. The ranch was her home. It was her connection to her father. It was the only place in the world where she felt completely like herself. The idea of leaving it for 2 weeks and possibly much longer, if she passed the evaluation, made her feel unsteady in a way she was not used to. Marcus did not dismiss her feelings. He did not tell her to toughen up or push through it. He told her something different. He said that her father had built the ranch to last. He said the land would still be there when she came back. The mountains would still be there. The horses would still be there. And he said that Dale, if he were alive, would not want Elena to spend her entire life within the borders of the ranch just because it was safe. He said Dale had raised her to be capable, and being capable meant being willing to step into the unknown when the opportunity was real. Elena thought about that for 3 days. On the 4th day, she called Chen and told him she was in. 2 weeks later, she flew to North Carolina. A military vehicle picked her up at the airport and drove her deep into the mountains along narrow roads that wound through dense forest. The facility was remote. It sat in a valley surrounded by ridgelines on all sides with no civilian structures visible in any direction. There were several buildings, a handful of barrack-style housing units, and multiple shooting ranges of varying length and terrain. The longest range stretched out to 1,500 yards across a natural meadow with hills and tree lines that created complex wind patterns. Elena was assigned a small room in one of the housing units. It was clean and simple. A bed, a desk, a lamp, a closet. It reminded her of the guest room at Marcus's house in Virginia Beach, except quieter. She unpacked her bag, put on her boots, and walked outside. The air was cold and smelled like pine. The mountains around the facility were dark green, almost black in the fading light. She stood there and breathed it in. It was not Montana, but it was land, real land, with trees and wind and sky. She felt a small piece of the tension in her chest loosen. The evaluation began the next morning. Elena was one of 4 civilians selected for the program. The other 3 were men. One was a competitive long-range shooter from Texas who had won multiple national championships. Another was a retired police sniper from Ohio who had spent 20 years on a SWAT team. The third was a hunting guide from Alaska who had been shooting in extreme cold weather conditions his entire life. All 3 of them were experienced, confident, and skilled. The evaluators were a team of 5 active-duty military personnel, led by a senior chief petty officer named Rawlings. Rawlings was in his late 30s, compact and muscular, with a quiet intensity that reminded Elena of Holt. He did not waste words. He gave instructions once and expected them to be followed. He treated all 4 civilians the same way, with professional respect and zero favoritism. He made it clear on the first morning that the evaluation was not about proving who was the best shooter. It was about determining who had the temperament, the adaptability, and the teaching ability to work effectively with military snipers. The first few days focused on basic marksmanship assessments. Each civilian was tested on accuracy at multiple distances using standardized military rifles. Elena performed well, but so did the others. The Texan was exceptional at distances between 500 and 800 yards. The retired police sniper was the fastest and most accurate in close to medium range drills. The Alaskan was steady and reliable across all distances. Elena's strength showed most clearly at the extreme long range, anything beyond 800 yards, where her patience and her ability to read natural wind patterns gave her a noticeable edge. But the real evaluation began on the 4th day, when Rawlings introduced something none of the civilians had expected. He told them they would each be assigned a pair of active-duty military snipers. Their task was not to outshoot these snipers. Their task was to teach them something. Anything. A technique. A perspective. A way of thinking about a problem. The military snipers had been briefed and told to be open to learning, but also to push back if they disagreed. The evaluators would observe everything and assess not just the civilians' knowledge, but their ability to communicate, adapt, and connect with people who came from a completely different world. Elena was paired with 2 young snipers, both in their mid-20s. Their names were Hayes and Orozco. Hayes was tall and lean, with a quiet confidence and precise movements. Orozco was shorter, broader, and more talkative, with a sharp sense of humor and an energy that reminded Elena of the young hands she sometimes hired on the ranch. Both of them were skilled. Both of them had completed the military sniper school and had operational experience. And both of them, Elena could tell from the moment she met them, were uncertain about what a civilian ranchwoman from Montana could possibly teach them. Elena did not try to impress them. She did not lecture. She did not show off. On their first session together, she simply asked them to show her how they shot. She lay down next to them on the range and watched. She studied their positions, their breathing, their trigger pulls, their scope adjustments. She asked questions, simple questions. Why do you adjust the scope at that point? Why do you hold your breath there instead of here? Why do you move your support hand at that angle? Hayes and Orozco answered her questions patiently, perhaps a little cautiously. They were waiting for the lesson, waiting for the lecture, waiting for the civilian expert to tell them everything they were doing wrong. But Elena did not do that. After watching them shoot for about an hour, she said only one thing. She said she noticed that both of them adjusted their windage on the scope before every shot, even when the wind had not changed between shots. She said that on the ranch, she had learned to read the wind once, commit to her reading, and then trust it. She said the constant adjusting was costing them time and, more importantly, confidence. Every time they touched the scope between shots, they were telling themselves that their first reading might have been wrong, and that doubt, even a tiny amount of it, could shift a shot by an inch at 500 yards and by a foot at 1,000. Hayes looked at her. Orozco looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Orozco asked her to show them what she meant. Elena nodded. She settled behind the rifle. She read the wind once, slowly and carefully, studying the flags and the grass and the movement of the air across the meadow. She dialed her scope, and then she fired 5 rounds at the 700-yard target without touching the scope again. All 5 were within an inch of center. She did not adjust between shots. She did not second-guess her wind call. She trusted it, committed to it, and executed. Hayes and Orozco tried the same approach. Their first attempts were not as clean. They were so used to adjusting between shots that holding the scope steady felt wrong, like driving without checking the mirrors. But by the end of the session, their groups had tightened. Orozco, who was naturally more instinctive, picked it up faster. Hayes, who was more analytical, took longer but eventually felt the difference. By the end of the second day, both of them were shooting tighter groups at long range than they had in months. The days continued. Elena worked with Hayes and Orozco every morning and afternoon. She taught them small things. How to use natural terrain features to read wind at distances where flags were not available. How to slow their breathing even further by focusing on the pause between exhale and inhale rather than the inhale itself. How to position the body so that the natural point of aim aligned with the target without muscular effort, which reduced fatigue during long shooting sessions. None of these techniques were secret. None of them were revolutionary. They were simply things Elena had learned over decades of shooting alone on a ranch in Montana, things that had been refined by repetition and solitude, and the quiet patience her father had planted in her like a seed. It was trust. Hayes and Orozco began to see Elena not as a civilian outsider, but as someone who understood the rifle at a fundamental level. They began asking her questions not just about shooting, but about focus, about managing pressure, about staying calm when the stakes were high. Elena answered them the same way she answered every question, honestly and simply. She told them about the nights on the ranch when she had to walk out into the dark with her rifle to deal with a predator threatening the cattle. She told them about the fear she felt in those moments and how she had learned to let the fear exist without letting it control her. She said fear was not the enemy. The enemy was the belief that you had to eliminate fear before you could act. You did not. You just had to act anyway. Rawlings watched all of this. He watched Elena with the two snipers every day. He took notes. He spoke with Hayes and Orozco separately and asked them how it was going. Both of them, independently, said the same thing. They said she was different from any instructor they had ever had. She did not tell them what to do. She showed them. And she listened. She listened to them in a way that made them feel like she actually cared about their growth, not just about demonstrating her own skill. The evaluation period ended after 2 weeks. On the final day, Rawlings gathered all 4 civilians together and gave them their results. The Texan had performed excellently in marksmanship, but had struggled in the teaching component. He was used to competing, not coaching, and his approach had been too focused on demonstrating his own abilities rather than developing the skills of the snipers he worked with. He was offered a limited consulting role. The retired police sniper had done well in both marksmanship and teaching, but had clashed with his assigned snipers over tactical differences. He was offered a role with conditions. The Alaskan had been steady and effective and was offered a full position. Then Rawlings turned to Elena. He said her marksmanship scores were the highest among the 4 civilians, particularly at distances beyond 800 yards. He said her teaching evaluations were the highest as well. Hayes and Orozco had both submitted written statements requesting to continue working with her. He said the evaluators had been unanimous in their assessment. Elena was offered a full position in the program with the additional designation of lead civilian instructor, a role that had not existed before and that had been created specifically for her. Elena sat with that for a moment. She looked at Rawlings. She looked at the other 3 men sitting next to her. She thought about the ranch. She thought about the mountains outside the window. She thought about her father. Then she accepted. Over the next year, Elena traveled between the ranch and various military training facilities across the country. She worked with dozens of military snipers from different branches. She developed a reputation that spread quietly through the special operations community. People did not talk about her loudly or publicly. There were no news articles. There were no social media posts. The program was classified, and Elena preferred it that way. She did not want attention. She wanted to teach. She wanted to share what her father had given her. Her methods became known among the snipers she trained. The wind commitment technique, the body alignment approach, the breathing pause focus. These small adjustments began appearing in the field performance of operators who had trained with her. Commanders noticed improvements in long-range accuracy during exercises. Some of them traced it back to Elena's sessions and requested more time with her in the training rotation. But it was a moment during her 3rd rotation that defined everything. Elena was at a training facility in the desert southwest, working with a team of Marine Scout snipers. During a live-fire exercise on a particularly challenging range, the wind conditions became extreme. Gusts were coming from multiple directions, shifting every few seconds, creating a swirling chaos that made accurate long-range shooting nearly impossible. The exercise called for each shooter to engage a target at 1,200 yards. One by one, the Marines stepped up. One by one, they missed. Not by much. But at 1,200 yards, not much is everything. Team leader, a gunnery sergeant named Diaz, was frustrated. He had trained these men himself. He knew they were good, but the wind was defeating them. He looked at Elena, who was standing nearby, observing. He did not ask her to shoot. He did not need to. He just looked at her, and she understood. Elena walked to the firing line. She picked up the rifle. She lay down in the prone position. She looked through the scope at the 1,200-yard target, a steel silhouette standing alone in the desert heat. The wind was wild. The mirage through the scope was thick and constantly shifting. She studied the conditions for a long time, longer than she usually did. She watched the desert brush move at different distances. She watched the dust lift and settle. She watched the heat shimmer bend and twist above the sand. Then she did something that surprised even herself. She closed her eyes. Just for a moment, she let the visual chaos disappear. She listened. She listened to the wind, not to analyze it, not to calculate it, just to feel it, to let it become part of her awareness, the way the wind on the ranch had always been part of her awareness. She had grown up in the wind. She had lived in it her whole life. She knew it not as data, but as a living thing, something that moved and breathed and had patterns that could be felt before they could be seen. She opened her eyes. She looked through the scope. She made her adjustments. She did not overthink them. She trusted what she felt. She took a breath. She let it out. She waited for the pause, and she fired. The bullet traveled for nearly 2 seconds across 1,200 yards of chaotic desert wind. The men standing behind Elena watched through their optics. Some of them were holding their breath. The bullet struck the steel silhouette dead center. The ring echoed across the desert floor. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Diaz let out a breath and shook his head slowly. He looked at Elena as she stood up and brushed the sand off her clothes. He said 2 words. How? How? She thought about how to explain what she had just done, how to put into words something that was not about formulas or adjustments or training manuals, how to describe a connection to the natural world that had been built not in classrooms or on military ranges, but on a piece of land in Montana where the wind never stopped blowing, and a quiet man taught his daughter to listen to it. She said, "I stopped trying to beat the wind. I just joined it." Diaz stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned to his Marines and told them to listen carefully. For the next 3 hours, Elena worked with the team. She did not tell them to close their eyes. She did not tell them anything mystical or abstract. She simply taught them to expand their awareness beyond the scope, to use their peripheral senses, to feel the wind on their skin and incorporate that feeling into their shot process alongside the visual data. It was a small shift, but by the end of the session, 3 of the 6 Marines had hit the 1,200-yard target in wind conditions that had defeated all of them earlier that day. Months later, when the year-long program ended, Elena returned to her ranch. She drove up the dirt road, parked her truck near the barn, and walked to the porch. She sat down in the same chair where her father had sat every evening. She looked out at the valley. The mountains were still there. The horses were still there. The wind was still blowing. She reached into her bag and pulled out something Rawlings had given her on her last day at the facility. It was a small wooden plaque with a brass plate. Engraved on the plate were the words, "For Elena Marsh," who reminded us that the best shooters do not fight the world, they listen to it. Below that, the signatures of every sniper she had trained over the course of the year. Elena held the plaque in her hands and ran her thumb across the engraving. She looked out at the valley. The sun was setting. The sky was turning orange and pink. The same colors it had been the evening she had decided to accept Marcus's invitation all those months ago. Everything had changed since then. And nothing had changed. She was still the same woman. The same rancher. The same daughter of a man who had taught her everything she needed to know without ever raising his voice. She set the plaque on the railing next to the chair. She leaned back. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind move through the valley. And somewhere, in the quiet space between one gust and the next, she could almost hear her father's voice, steady and calm, saying the only word he ever needed to say, again.